There are few infractions in this multiverse severe enough to disturb the long-dormant mechanisms of the old tribunal. Universal collapse? That's on the Monday docket. Pantheon-tier deities laundering reality taxes across 12 dimensions. Practically charming. One once tried to write off the heat death of a star as a business lunch, but preserving the emotional stability of a bear within a decaying and disintegrating mythos. That apparently constitutes heresy against narrative entropy, and thus a capital offense in the ever-ironic cosmological courts of law. The morning, like so many before it, began with the familiar yet uniquely demoralizing air of metaphysical dread. Not the exciting kind, mind you. Not the ominous thundercracks over a mountain peak as armies march. Variety. No, this was the bureaucratic dread. The kind that seeps in through the ceiling tiles. The kind that smells like overdue paperwork and sounds like the elevator music in a condemned administrative building. The library, that great beast of ink and whispering time, was unusually quiet. Not the kind of peace brought by enlightenment, but the clenched silence before revelation. Chronology seemed to hesitate. Even the shadows recoiled slightly, and as though unsure whether to extend or cower, I stirred my coffee, brewed from paradox beans, aged 22 timelines in recursive dread, with a spoon made from the spine of a misprinted prophecy. I peered into the central void of the library, where stories drifted like abandoned jellyfish, luminous with half-formed allegory, and stitched with unresolved metaphor. Something was deeply, irrevocably off. The restricted section hadn't screamed once. The thesaurus that usually cursed passers-by in dead languages had not hurled a single insult. Not one minor god had attempted to smuggle in a cursed USB. Even Croissant Shan had not threatened anyone with emotionally unstable eclairs. The normally comforting chaos of the place had condensed into something dangerously stable, an ominous order, taut and waiting to snap. I sighed. A sigh of such intensity it unalphabetized 3 sections on the floor below. The kind of sigh that makes other eldritch horrors send sympathy fruit baskets. And then the light folded. It did not flicker. It bent inward, like the syntax of a sentence collapsing under poor editing. The photons curled in on themselves, whispering theorems to each other as they abandoned linearity. From that conceptual dissonance emerged a shape, not a scroll, not a summons, but something worse. A narrative artifact wrapped in legalistic malice and bureaucratic origami. It smelled like expired punctuation and sounded like a thesis defense performed by a collapsing choir. The thing hovered politely over my desk. The air around it shuddered. It pulsed in formal Rulian Nagftharanax. Core. You are summoned. Judgment is due. Delightful. The object began unfurling across my workspace like a spectral spreadsheet of doom. Glyphs of recursion and decay traced themselves into the desk, carving polite condemnation with the grace of a flamethrower dipped in legalese. Every word that appeared rearranged local causality. The window blinked out of phase. My bookshelf turned into a nervous metaphor. Somewhere, a librarian screamed and then apologized. I stared. The kind of stare that could cause a procedural audit, or at least trigger a medium-sized existential audit form. I had seen these symbols before. Each one a bureaucratic rune of authority. Yog-Sothoth, Hastur, Azathoth. Not deputies, not minor aspects, not divine interns. These were the full, original, terribly unedited versions. Beings who speak in source code and blink entire philosophies into contradiction. And I, Cthulhu, former dread god, current archivist of impossible stories, librarian of realities too stubborn to die, had been summoned, not for corruption, not for apocalyptic negligence, but for sentimentality, for letting a bear hum. I considered ignoring it. In fact, I very nearly filed the summons under suggestions. After all, I had previously deferred extradition request from Olympus, returned jury duty from Limbo with a note that said deceased, and once served an eviction notice to an entire pantheon just to get a coffee machine back. But this wasn't that kind of threat. This was primal editorial scrutiny. The sort of divine disapproval that doesn't yell but quietly rewrites you out of the margins. I reached for my emergency blend, caffeine distilled through nostalgia, despair, and the exact moment a dream turns to regret. It scolded pleasantly. The artifact pulsed again, patient in the way only inevitability can be. The library had noticed. The temperature dropped by several metaphors. Walls sagged into parentheses. A filing cabinet opened unbidden and revealed only a single sticky note. Do something, you overgrown octopus. I ignored it. There are some conversations you only have with yourself once. My eyes instead fell upon the honey jar, half full, labeled in shaky, earnest handwriting for later, just in case. Pooh had left it behind. After I broke the unbreakable rules, breached metaphysical law, and stitched the 100 Acre Wood, fragmented, recursive, emotionally rich, into the narrative architecture of the library. Anchored it not with power, but with meaning, with characters who believed. I remember the sky hemorrhaging deja vu. Sleep Nora flickered between childhood memory and elegiac spectre. Alice rewrote causality with paradoxical spite. Madeline cursed her way through an interdimensional compliance audit, weaponizing paperwork with surgical ferocity. And Pooh just sat, calm, present, cradling the remnants of a collapsing story like it still deserved to be remembered. Like kindness had a place in entropy. He hummed. It wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't a spell. It was just a sound of being. Gentle, timeless. It filled the cracks where logic bled out. And it stayed. So yes, I cheated. I bent the library structure around him. I tethered memory to ink, dream to spine. I did what gods and editors both fear. I preserved something. And now the tribunal had noticed. I stood. The chair whined like a guilty metaphor. I took the jar. It was warm. It pulsed gently in my hand. Reality sensed my decision and backed away like a nervous usher. The war unwalled. Reality peeled back with courtly precision. The scent of verdicts past rolled in. I stepped into the breach. The Tribunal of Narrative Continuity collapse. The chamber was not a room. It was a decision waiting to be made. There was no flaw. Only consequence. No walls, only unfinished stories leaning inward. The ceiling was the color of endings, and it knew my name. They were already assembled. Yog-Sothoth, a grammar vortex given fractal skin. He did not exist linearly. His presence read you before you entered. Words orbited him like law citations. Fdrach Gorka. Drath, Cathel Torren Zen. The constant resists. The tale is guilty. unspoken precedent. Then Hastur, a sentence fragment stretched into contempt. His robes were stage directions no actor could follow. He moved like regret, trying to mime an encore. Scene, the bear refuses. Curtain, stays closed. Problem, he continues. He reeked of cancelled finales and half-finished scripts. And finally, Azathoth, the axis, the dream, the prime edit. His presence did not arrive. It displaced in space. The idea of sequence faltered in his shadow. My mind buckled, then reassembled itself with mild grammatical errors. He breathed. Reality apologized. I bowed. A shallow tilt, enough to acknowledge absurd authority, not enough to surrender to it. Well, I offered, a recursive prosecutor, a thespian grudge, and a metaphysical black hole. If this is a tribunal, someone forgot the crumpets. Yog-Sothoth paused, spiraling outward like a redacted memo. You have allowed emotional recursion to persist. You have bound constants within decay. You have protected, colored. The word struck harder than any curse. Hope. He said it like heresy. I adjusted the jar. Its warmth steadied me. If you're hoping for contrition, I said, you're mistaking me for a regretful protagonist. Azathoth blinked. The floor beneath me briefly remembered being a childhood trauma. You fear him, I continued, not because he's powerful, because he endures, because he harms, because he believes, and nothing you create can undo that. The chamber shifted, cause and effect whispered nervously. Yog-Sothoth spun into declaration. Call your witnesses of contamination. The chamber restructured itself, sharpening into accusation. Paragraphs held their breath, and I, clutching a jar full of defiance and nostalgia, prepared to summon the few who knew what we saved. The tribunal chamber didn't shift in the ways mortals comprehend space or time. It transmuted according to metaphysical expectation, bending not to laws of physics but to the gravitational pull of scrutiny. The anticipation of judgment twisted the conceptual framework of the room like parchment curling before fire. Yog-Sothoth's orbit tightened, fractals folding into self-justifying spirals. Hastur shimmered in and out of legibility, like a narrative left half-edited by a drunk playwright. Azathoth, the absent presence, the sleeping sovereign of unreason, remained unmoved. His inaction a monolithic force more threatening than any scream. For a moment I could feel Azathoth's attention tilt toward me, like an entire cosmos adjusting its spine. It was not action. It was not recognition. It was potential, and it was terrifying. I swallowed something I pretended was only dread. And then came Madeline. No blaze of glory, no scream of heralds, no mythic flourish, just the crisp, unflinching entrance of a woman who knew exactly which regulations she was violating, simply by being here. She did not walk into the courtroom. She executed protocol in transit. Her heels struck the mythstone floor with calibrated precision. Her charcoal gray suit defied entropy through sheer administrative willpower. She held no weapon, wore no sigils, but she brought a clipboard, still hot from closing 2 pantheonic audits, and incinerating 1 minor legal loophole in the God of Forgetting's tax exemption clause. The tribunal didn't acknowledge her. That, of course, was confirmation they had. I appear under protest, she said. Not a plea, not an apology. A bureaucratic thesis weaponized into a sentence. The voice of someone who once denied Odin paid leave during Ragnarok because the battlefield was not a protected medical condition. Yog-Sothoth paused in recursive disapproval. Emotion hidden behind syntax. Reveal motive. She responded with an eyebrow that violated decorum, physics, and six gods' fragile sense of superiority. As Director of Interdimensional HR and Compliance, I ensure structural narrative integrity across all library-affiliated continua. This includes regulating manifestations of mythic recursion, limiting unstructured emotional collapse, and maintaining bureaucratic resilience within chaotic substrates. Your concerns fall under Section 14G of Anti-Corruption Clause, Worked Group 67. She clicked her pen. The sound rewrote nearby causality. The entity in question, designated Pooh, is not a rogue variable. He is an employee. Under Code 78 Zeta, Archivist of Gentle Truths, approved and reviewed. Formally integrated into the library's metaphysical roster with clear job responsibilities. Your current objection reflects a misunderstanding of both role assignment and narrative evolution. Hastur, ever the dramatist, flickered forward with disdain. Gentleness is not a role. Madeline did not look up. It is now. Regulatory necessity redefines scope. Stability must evolve if collapse is to be meaningfully measured. Yog-Sothoth condensed like a syllogism having a seizure. Evolution of law invites recursion. Recursion breeds paradox. Paradox corrupts entropy. She snapped open her clipboard. Data trends post-merger indicate a 47.8% reduction in recursive myth collapse, a 31.6% improvement in emotional memory retention, and a 100% cessation of pastry-based temporal distortions. A nearby shelf in the tribunal creaked. Somewhere Croissant Shan hiccuped with guilty pride. Additionally, Madeline continued, Cthulhu has exhibited increased procedural coherence. No attempted self-nullification. No unsanctioned erasures. No reformatting of existential indexing protocols for a full fiscal quarter. That, under Clause 19b, constitutes significant internal stabilization and cannot be disregarded as anomalous. Yog-Sothoth began to unravel in response. You manufacture your metrics to simulate order. Your compliance is aesthetic. She paused. A deliberate, weaponized pause. Your assertion that emotional constancy constitutes a threat to entropic systems is unfounded. Gentle truths are not recursive corruption. They are anchoring nodes. They contextualize collapse. Without them, decay loses narrative legitimacy. Yog-Sothoth's presence sharpened into logical outrage. Stability defies dissolution. It is anti-entropic. She finally looked up. Entropy without narrative is statistical boredom. You crave destruction, not decay. But decay implies something was worth preserving. Pooh is not contamination. He is context. And your court misunderstands him because it misunderstands the purpose of structural mythologies that do not scream. She executed the most minimal of bows, legally sufficient, emotionally non-existent, and vanished with the silence of a redacted clause. The room chilled. Then came the second witness. Vistaki was not summoned. She was recalled. The chamber softened, as if suddenly steeped in ancestral tea. Lighting adjusted to memory's internal logic, more golden, less cruel. Dust floated in significance rather than entropy. The walls curved like the interior of a remembered embrace. Where Madeline had wielded procedural enforcement, Vistaki embodied recollection. Her golden tentacle hair swayed with the rhythm of timelines, half forgotten and barely healed. Her honeycomb eyes shimmered with recursive empathy. When she stepped forward, the floor bloomed with sigils of forgotten lullabies and echoing names. "Esteemed Tribunal," she began, her voice like a gospel wrapped in velvet. "I do not come to defend the librarian. I come to remember what he preserved." She raised a single hand and strands of memory unfurled, scenes interwoven. Pooh stumbling into Olympus bearing questions instead of weapons. Sleep Nora leaping through fractured identity to reclaim selfhood. Alice diagramming paradox traps with frightening elegance. The 100 Acre Wood tethered to the library through grace and defiance. "A bear once came to the gods," she said. "He was not armed. He brought no logic, no prophecy. He hummed. He shared honey. He asked earnestly, and the world did not end. It paused." Hastur quivered. "Truth that doesn't collapse is inertia." She turned slowly to Azathoth. "And yet, you blinked, not to unmake, but to remember." Then to me, quieter. "He didn't command Pooh. He entrusted him. He trusted me. No formal contract, no divinely notarized pact, just belief. Story passed through hands not seeking credit." She lifted a scrap of paper. "He gave me this, a child's drawing of a bee, labeled in crooked handwriting. A friend." Yog-Sothoth cracked across several syllables. "This is nostalgia, sentimentality. You confuse survival with sincerity." She turned to him, and her voice, though still soft, became devastatingly precise. "And you confuse forgetting with objectivity." She turned to the tribunal. "You call this contamination. I call it preservation. Memory is the scaffold of collapse. Without it, entropy becomes incoherent violence. You've forgotten too much." She took a bow and was gone. And the room dimmed, not from shadow, but from introspection. The heat came next. Not a metaphor. Actual fire. Hephaestus did not arrive so much as ignite his presence into the space. The air folded inward around the furnace of his arrival. Blacksmith of myth and maker of meanings, he stepped forth, limping with dignity older than time. His forge cloak steamed off divine soot. Sparks followed him like gossip. In his hand, he held the fractured prototype of the honey blade. "The blade," he said simply, and dropped it with a clang that made the tribunal twitch. "Came to me," he said. "Didn't ask for power, asked for gentleness. Said he needed something sharp enough to cut fate, but kind enough not to wound those who held it." Yog-Sothoth trembled. "Kindness cannot survive entropy." Hephaestus smiled like a god who'd lost wars but won arguments. "Then you don't understand kindness. It survives precisely because it doesn't expect to's." He lifted the blade's hilt. "He brought me the story. Didn't explain it. Just said, a bear will carry this one day, and you'll want him to. So I forged it. From stories I didn't believe in. From hope I didn't have." He stepped forward, staring down the tribunal. "And you think he's guilty for preserving that? No, you're furious because it worked. He didn't break your laws. He reframed the game. And now you can't burn the board without proving him right." He turned to me. "You didn't just protect a bear. You armed a myth." And then he left, dragging embers and emotional implication behind him like a comet that refused to end quietly. The tribunal did not speak, but something had changed. Not in the void, in me. And I realized they weren't weighing his story. They were measuring my belief in it. And for the first time since the summons, I felt unsure. What if they were right? What if this wasn't salvation but stubbornness dressed as mercy? What if I'd saved a bear and doomed the myth? The silence in the tribunal chamber had acquired mass, not a poetic exaggeration, but an actual quantifiable density. Gravitational, narrative, and emotional, it permeated every molecule of the room, replacing breathable air with the consequences of metaphysical scrutiny. I stood in that weight, no longer as the librarian or the overseer of fractured timelines, but as something more vulnerable and exposed, a subject under cosmic review. Yog-Sothoth recoiled inward, each recursive syllable collapsing into itself like a self-consuming thesis. His judgment was already written, long before he vocalized it. "The contamination has justified itself," he said, his voice laced with reluctant acknowledgement. "But it remains constant, unbroken. That is threat." Hastur followed, materializing with theatrical severity. His pronouncement was not spoken so much as declared across conceptual space. Verdict: myth persists. Error: ending interrupted. And then Azathoth moved. He did not roar or awaken. He stirred in the way a black hole shifts, without acknowledgement, without will. His breath didn't resonate. It redefined resonance. The sound that followed was not one meant for ears, but for the scaffolding of reality itself. It flattened the chamber with surgical indifference. Then came the imperative: kneel. Not a command, not a request. It was a statement of supposed inevitability, imposed like an axiom. It pressed upon the multiverse with the certainty of gravity, of recursion, of endings that believe themselves final. My knees buckled, not out of weakness, but because my metaphysical framework faltered. Timelines shivered around me, alternate versions of myself surfacing and vanishing, some compliant, some erased before they could resist. I nearly succumbed, but I remembered the jar. It was still warm. The note, "Pooh, left, for later, just in case." This was that moment. This was that case. I stood again, steadied not by strength, but by conviction. The tribunal's gaze constricted, tightening around me like a noose braided from unspoken clauses. This wasn't about authority. It was about confirmation. Azathoth didn't want obedience to enforce his will. He wanted it as proof that entropy prevails, that tenderness folds before inevitability. But inevitability, I found, is not particularly inventive. I exhaled a laugh, not rebellious, not triumphant. It was weariness sharpened into irony. The sound didn't echo. It resisted being acknowledged by the chamber's design. Ah, so this is where the ineffable dream thing demands a ritualized submission from the exhausted librarian. Very cosmic, very on brand. Yog-Sothoth pulsed with procedural irritation. Defiance is not clever. It is delay. Then consider this a long-form scheduling conflict. I stepped forward. I will not kneel for entropy masquerading as decorum. I won't submit to recursive logic that can't withstand a nursery rhyme. And I certainly won't validate a tribunal that tries to categorize emotional continuity as narrative contamination. I raised to the honey jar. This is your problem. Not the bear. Not me. This moment. This object. a distilled act of gentleness preserved in a world of collapse, a defiant artifact of emotional persistence. It outlasts your tantrums, your decrees, your penchant for unmaking. It endures, and that's what terrifies you, because it means some stories resist closure. Azathoth exhaled. The floor below me didn't tremble. It vanished, erased by narrative exhaustion. Yet I remained upright, suspended not by physics, but by intent. Still, I did not kneel. You label him a breach, but he is the blueprint. He shows us what survives, not through power, not through exceptionalism, but through consistency, through presence. He harms when others scream, and that constancy, that is not weakness, it's resistance. The room vibrated with suppressed contradiction. Every atom of me strained under the Tribunal's gaze, caught in a frictionless tug-of-war between presence and erasure. There was a time when you made stories that mattered. Now you penalize anything with meaning as if it were plagiarizing the cosmos. So yes, I saved the bear. I rewrote a few metaphysical guidelines, possibly annexed a mythological entity or two, but I cared. And apparently in a bureaucracy of apocalyptic cynics, that's heresy. Hastur glitched mid-dialogue, stage directions bleeding into syntax. Scene collapse. Speaker will not submit. Props. Invalid. I raised the jar higher. He gave me this knowing I'd never express gratitude, knowing I'd never admit I needed it. He was right. Until now. The jar glowed softly, unwavering. I will not kneel. Then came the true silence. Azathoth shuddered, which was a type of multi-dimensional dance which roughly translates to eldritch gods thinking deeply. The Tribunal hesitated. Yog-Sothoth retreated into self-looping dissonance. Hastur dissolved, mid-monologue, into unresolved stage fog. Azathoth neither punished nor retreated. He paused, not with mercy, not in defeat, in contemplation. I could feel the one above all, that blind idiot god, observing me with the ineffable gaze of every atom in existence looking my way. And then, the multiverse exhaled, and he let me remain. The courtroom collapsed, not in violence, but with the finality of a decision unspoken, like a book closed before the last sentence was read. And I was still there, holding the jar, bearing witness, still Cthulhu, still defiant, still myself. Returning to the library was not so much a journey, as it was a reconfiguration of self across dimensional certainty. Passing from the Tribunal's judgment into the familiarity of the library's architecture didn't soothe me. It recalibrated me. Every hallway, every whispered breath of the archives, responded not just to my presence, but to what I had become. The arches above my office did not creak with age, but instead contracted almost imperceptibly, as if bowing to a change in protocol. The shelves, which have always known more than they admit, shifted in the manner of staff watching their supervisor return from a war tribunal, subtle, wary, bracing for unspoken updates. No angel sang. No applause broke through the infinite interstices of this place. Only the faint hum of administrative inertia and the low thrum of metaphysical machinery, resuming function after potential deletion. A stack of unsigned memos awaited me like unpaid emotional debts. Somewhere deep within the pastry quadrant, a faint buzzing, perhaps Croissant Chan's oven sighing in existential relief, cut through the stillness. Normalcy. or its closest library-approved cousin, resumed itself without commentary. I walked the aisles slowly, not as an act of hesitation, but of recalibration. The library is not a place where time passes. It's where time is stored. And in this moment I could feel every second echoing back to me. The 100 Acre Wood's subtle presence was still embedded in the stacks, resonant, gentle, humming like a pocket of narrative resistance that had not been unwritten. Outside my office door, Madeline had left a compliance report. A single checkbox was marked, returned, functioning. On the reverse side, in script so curt and bureaucratically furious that it could only be hers, read, 2-day cooldown on unauthorized myth grafting. 3 days if pastries were involved. I considered mounting a legal defense. I didn't. Vistaki, ever the archivist of resonance, had not left words. She had left a single thread, honey-colored, glowing with soft recursive energy, coiled atop my desk. As I entered, it pulsed once, and I recognized the sigil it formed, the Lion symbol for endure. She always knew the things I refused to articulate. And Pooh, his nook was unoccupied, but the blanket remained contoured with his familiar shape, and a book lay open on the armrest, one I'd seen him reread countless times. The page was marked not with a bookmark, but a smudge of honey and a childish doodle, a bear, smiling. I sat. The Tribunal's weight had not left me. It had merely adjusted vectors, redistributed its density. I still existed. But survival in the library is not a declaration of victory. It is merely confirmation of unresolved usefulness. The change was not in my position, but in my understanding of what it meant to hold it. I hadn't prevailed. I had simply refused to collapse. And that, I realized, was a more dangerous form of agency. The honey jar was still in my possession. Pooh's label still read, with his usual blunt sincerity, "For later, just in case." I stood and walked to the shelf where it had first been placed. The air shifted as I approached, not because of magic, but because of attention. The library watches when its caretakers shelve meaning. I replaced the jar carefully, then added a secondary label beneath the original. This one, mine, read, filed, emotional contraband, handle with care. It felt accurate. Borderline treasonous, comfortingly absurd. Somewhere down the eastern wing, the lights brightened incrementally. A breeze that had no meteorological justification ruffled the pages of an atlas that hadn't been opened in millennia. I heard a ripple of laughter, sleep Nora, perhaps mid-prank or mid-flight, echoing faintly from the pastry nexus. Croissant Shan's oven puffed approvingly, like a sentient creature glad to resume unlicensed baking. From the direction of HR, a clipboard snapped with precise finality. I chose to interpret it as Madeline's bureaucratic benediction. I resumed my rounds, passed by Vistaki's memory hive, where ancestral vibrations continued their golden, mournful cadence. Paused at Alice's paradox spiral, which now included a new loop, elegantly rendered, unmistakably deliberate. Not a correction, an acknowledgement. This place, these figures, this improbable network of persistence, none of them had been rescued. They had been selected, not by divine prophecy, not by multiversal inevitability, by me. I didn't act because I knew I would succeed. I acted because I chose to. That, perhaps, is the rarest heresy of all. I turned back once, looking towards the jar. It shimmered faintly. Not because of enchantment, not because of residual mythic radiation, but because it had survived context. I told them I wouldn't kneel, I muttered aloud. Then after a pause, but perhaps I did learn how to preserve something, just for later.